In this video, we're going to be going from trash to tower, complete with a replaceable Elden Ring style door and top runic circle. There's a lot to cover in this video, so let's jump in. The structure of this tower is going to be made from a Pringles can and this iced tea container. And the first step is going to be to wash them out. After I have them thoroughly washed, I'm going to go ahead and position and play with them a little bit and just get a good picture of what I want in my head. I decided I wanted part of the Pringles can to be a side structure and then the other part of it to go on top of the main structure to give it a more interesting and gothic feel. So I measured up 4 3/4 on the bottom of the Pringles can, which happened to align perfectly with the bottom of the nutritional facts label, and I cut through it with my hobby saw. That section there would be the top of the tower. The other half I'm going to turn into a side structure by again using the nutrition label as a guide, cutting that section out and hot gluing it to the iced tea container. But before I decided to attach the side structure to the iced tea container, I decided the iced tea container needed to be a little bit shorter, 7.5 inches to be exact, so that I could divide the main section of my tower by 2.5 inches evenly. When I was assembling my components, I hot glued the top of the tower to it as well, but I wouldn't suggest doing that if you're going to follow along with this build, and later on I'm going to be ripping it off. Next, I decided to start working on the base of the tower, which I constructed out of 2-inch pink foam. I decided to go through some of my old stencils, in particular the 6-inch hex from my dollar store Ultimate Terrain video. Playing around with it, I decided I really wanted that shape on the base of the main tower. So I used it again as a stencil here and then added a 4-inch circle for the side structure. Because I had a loose picture in my mind of what I was trying to achieve, I ended up gluing the whole thing to the base, but again in later steps, I ended up ripping it off. Looking at what I had now, I decided I hadn't broken up the form of the trash I was using as my understructure, and I thought it might look too obvious if I just went ahead and added bricks as is. So I decided to add columns. I added 1 column that would be for each corner of the hex, and these ended up being 2.5 inches tall, 3/4 of an inch wide, and 1/2 inch deep. I like how those columns were looking, but I felt like the tower was still missing something, and I decided that I wanted to add ribs to my tower. I did this by adding foam that was 1/4 inch thick by 3/4 of an inch wide, cutting them to fit and gluing them down at those 2.5 inch marks. My next step was to go back to the base and put on the finishing touches. I decided to have bricks of multiple sizes. I did 2 rows of large blocks that ended up being 1/2 inch deep by 3/4 of an inch tall and 1 inch long. Then, deciding to make a reveal, I used smaller bricks of 1/2 inch tall by 3/4 of an inch long and 1/4 inch deep. The base was starting to look a lot better in my opinion, but I didn't want to see where the bricks ended and my original base frame began, so I decided to add a top plate. To accomplish this, I turned to my Cricut to make a stencil. If you've been watching my channel, you already know that I have high opinions of the Cricut machine, and it's honestly going to play a significant role in this project. So taking my stenciled shape, I cut it out of dollar store foam core and beveled all the edges with my knife. Then I simply hot glued that down and freehanded what would be the outer accent tiles. I decided to add a 6-inch hex to the top of the can so I could have an as above, so below feel between the 2 sections of my main structure. One of the last things that I want you to take note of here is that later on I'm going to be putting a hole in the center for lighting effects, and that you should probably do that now instead of waiting like I did. Next, I added a subroof to my side structure, and this step could wait until after bricking, but it's not going to matter much because I'm going to be covering any gaps with flashing. And it wasn't until this point when I decided I wanted to start adding LED effects to the build. And I just happened to have these remote controlled ones that I bought on Amazon a while back. So I grabbed one of them and carved out a nice little home for it in the base.
Go home! That's your home!
And from here, I moved on to making windows so I could show off the lighting. And you might guess, and you'd be correct, that I used my Cricut. I eventually plan on doing a Windows remastered video, but you can find the file for this one and about 6 or so other styles that I've made on my Patreon if you're a member of the Fantastic Factory. These windows are cut on chipboard, and I'm just going to clean them up later with an X-Acto knife before making them rock hard and texturing them a bit with another one of my favorites, super glue and baking soda. Now that they're looking a lot more like stone, I'm going to give them a quick sanding before I pre-paint them and add the glass, so I don't have to try to get into those little edges later on. For the glass effect, I'm going to be turning to the black magic technique from my Windows video. I'm just not going to use any stain because I want to show off the LEDs that I installed. Finally, I'm going to plan out where I want them before cutting into the iced tea tube and then gluing them down. The next part of this project I like to think of as the brickening, and this is gonna take some time. But I did get to use up all my scrap foam, so that's gotta be worth something. And now would be a great time for me to touch on my sponsor of this video. Nobody. But I still suggest using Audiobow anyways, otherwise this can be a really boring step. And after nearly all the bricks were done, I made up my mind on the doorway. And here I took heavy inspiration from Elden Ring, starting by making archways in the same manner I made my windows, and fixing that into place. For the magic doorways, I used my Cricut and decided to use scraps of this Dollar Tree clear cutting mats that come in a 2-pack. I set my Cricut to the basic chipboard setting, then picked out my designs and finished cutting out the overall arch by hand. Again, you'll be able to find all these files on my Patreon. Then I installed chipboard tabs to hold the door down so that I could easily slide the design in and out, and finally, I finished all the brickwork. It was at this point, feeling proud of my project, I decided to show it to my beautiful wife. She looked at it and was like, "That's nice, but there's no lights in the top of it." My heart broken, I thought to myself, that is a good idea. So I put on a pair of gloves and tried using a hole saw to make the hole in the top of my Pringles can. That promptly ripped the top section right off of the main section, which ended up making the hole in the main section a little bit easier. After I finally got the holes made and I reattached my sections, I decided to get back at my wife and sacrificed her magnetic vent cover to the Cricut to make the changeable rune topper. The magnetic sheet is a setting on the Cricut, and I ended up getting lucky as it didn't cut all the way through. I decided to glue it down to circles cut out of that dollar store cutting mat, and then taking my X-Acto, I took the symbols out so that the light would show right through that. When all that was complete, I finally turned my attention to the stairway. Measuring the gap I left in the base for my stairs, which was 1 3/4 inches, I took 1/2 inch off so that I could add bricks to both sides of my stairs, and then I cut scraps of foam core all at 1 1/4 inches to make the stairs themselves. Then taking the leftover bricks, I put them on the sides of each of the stairs to tie them into the main structure of the tower. Now I went back to finish the roof on my side structure. I took some simple cardstock strips and glued them down to be flashing to cover the gaps. Then I used my Cricut again to make the tiles. And with that, the build was done. I decided to texture everything with an aluminum ball. Before I go over the whole paint scheme, I want to take a second to say thanks to all my amazing patrons, especially Michael and Natalie the Murphy Destroyer. Your support does not go unappreciated. Starting off my paint job, I mixed up a base coat of a really dark gray. So dark in fact that it looks black on camera. Added a little Mod Podge and some water. Then I covered everything but the side roof. From here I decided to start dry brushing, and I went with an overbrush of pewter gray and then with granite gray. Then I did a slightly heavier overbrush of this warm gray, and then that left a lot of variation in the warm gray without resorting to an airbrush. After that, I hand-picked bricks with burnt sienna in both the pewter and granite gray that I had already used. I gave it a final dusting dry brush with the lightest color, the granite gray, then painted the side roof with a nice deep red and used my favorite oil wash mixture on the whole thing. After that was dry, I went back to the columns and the ribs and then touched up the windows where necessary with a dark gray mixture that was still lighter than my base coat. Then I dry brushed those sections with pewter gray and granite gray so that the colors would look like they belong together but would still provide a nice contrast. That's going to be everything for this build. Let me know what you think of it in the comments down below, and if you want to see me do more of these trash to terrain videos. So like if you like the video, subscribe if you want to see more, ring the bell, and YouTube will let you know when dinner's ready. And until next time, keep all your fantasy fantastic.